China sent 32 containers of cargo to Iran on May 25, 2025. Not on a ship, not through any ocean, on a freight train that rolled 10,400 kilometers through scorching deserts, carved through mountain ranges, crossed 4 separate countries, and arrived in just 15 days. The same journey by sea takes up to 40 days. That is not a logistics achievement. That is a declaration of intent. For years, America's most powerful weapon against countries like Iran had nothing to do with missiles or soldiers. It was economic strangulation. Block the oil sales, freeze the bank accounts, cut the country off from global markets, and watch it slowly suffocate. That strategy has worked for decades because it rests on a single, almost invisible foundation. America controls the ocean. And if you need to move something in large quantities across this planet, you almost always have to use those waters. For Iran, every attempt to break free from that grip got pushed back, until a freight train quietly proved that you do not need the ocean at all. China built a route that runs entirely over land, through territory no Western Navy can patrol, arriving in Iran without a single dollar changing hands. The economic fence that took decades to build just had a massive hole punched through it. And what makes Washington genuinely alarmed is not just the hole itself, it is what is being built on the other side of it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how this railway was constructed, what it means for the balance of global power, and what China is planning beyond this single corridor. There is a 5-nation expansion already moving forward, a frozen Arctic route being developed in parallel, and a long-term strategy designed to shift global trade away from Western control entirely. The railway is just the opening move. Subscribe now and hit the like button so you never miss what we cover next. To understand why this matters as much as it does, you first need to understand the single geographic fact that forced China to build this railway in the first place. Because this story does not begin in Iran. It begins in a narrow strip of water in Southeast Asia that most people have never heard of, even though their entire lives depend on it staying open. There is a passage of water sitting between Malaysia and Indonesia called the Strait of Malacca. At its narrowest point, it is only 65 kilometers wide. If you drew a map of global trade and tried to find the single most critical bottleneck on the entire planet, this is the one you would land on every time. Over 94,000 ships pass through it every single year. Oil tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, all of them funneling through one narrow corridor to move goods between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. For China, this waterway is not simply important. It is the artery that keeps the entire economy alive. Around 80% of China's oil imports pass through this single passage. The world's second largest economy, running factories that supply products to nearly every nation on Earth, depends entirely on one narrow strip of water staying open. Everything runs on energy, and almost all of that energy flows through a gap that at its narrowest is barely wider than the distance from one end of a small city to the other. Here is the part that kept Chinese planners awake at night for years. Since 2019, the United States has had the right to dock warships and aircraft carriers at Singapore's deep-water naval bases. Singapore sits right at the entrance to the strait. In a serious conflict, the US could effectively close that passage within 24 hours. One decision in Washington, and China's energy supply switches off like a light. Not damaged, not disrupted, off. The alternatives are genuinely terrible.
The Lombok Strait and the Sunda Strait can serve as backup routes,
but both add thousands of kilometers to any journey and are nowhere near capable of handling the volume that currently moves through Malacca. Rerouting even a fraction of China's oil through those alternatives would take years of infrastructure investment and still leave China exposed to the same fundamental vulnerability. You would still be on water, still within reach of the same Navy. China needed something categorically different, a route that no Navy could threaten, no sanctions could reach, and no blockade could ever close. The answer was to abandon the ocean entirely. And the only country whose geography made that possible at real scale was Iran. Building a railway from China to Iran is not simply a matter of laying track across a long distance. It means crossing some of the most hostile terrain on the surface of this planet. Vast open deserts where sand shifts constantly beneath the surface. Mountain ranges in earthquake-prone zones where the ground itself cannot be trusted. Temperatures that crack concrete in summer and freeze equipment solid in winter. And the route passes through 4 completely different countries, each with its own borders, customs frameworks, legal systems, and railway gauges that were never designed to connect with each other. None of that stopped the builders. The line begins in western China and heads westward across Kazakhstan, then through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan before finally crossing into Iran and arriving at a major dry port near Tehran. 10,400 kilometers of connected track through terrain that most engineering teams would abandon before the survey was complete. To put that distance in perspective, it is roughly the same as flying from London to Los Angeles and still having several hundred kilometers left to cover. The project cost upward of $2 billion, funded through Chinese policy banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and a series of bilateral loan agreements that tied each participating country into long-term infrastructure partnerships with Beijing. One of the biggest technical challenges was not the terrain, it was the track itself. Russia and Central Asia use a broader rail gauge than China. A train that runs perfectly on Chinese rail simply cannot roll onto Central Asian track without modification. China's solution was to build automated bogie exchange stations at key border crossings, systems that swap the wheel assemblies on each container so it can ride on different track widths without being unloaded. Those stations cut transition time from several hours down to under 30 minutes. That is the difference between a corridor that functions and one that is too slow to matter. Then there was the question of survival. Key stretches of the line inside Iran were built underground, not simply to handle extreme weather, to protect the infrastructure from potential airstrikes. When you bury a railway because you are worried about missiles, you are not building a trade route. You are building strategic infrastructure designed to function during a conflict. That distinction is not lost on anyone in Washington. On May 25, 2025, the first freight train completed the full journey in 15 days. The equivalent sea route, winding through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Arabian Sea, and around the Persian Gulf, took between 30 and 40 days. The railway cut the journey in half, with no Western-controlled ports, no naval patrols, and no enforceable sanctions anywhere in the chain. But to understand what that actually means for Iran, you need to understand just how comprehensively those sanctions had worked before this train arrived. For years, Western sanctions functioned almost exactly as designed. Iran's oil exports collapsed under the pressure. Its currency shed much of its value. Companies around the world refused to do business with Iranian counterparties for fear of losing access to American markets. The message from Washington was delivered consistently and enforced aggressively. Trade with Iran and pay the price. For most of the world, that message was enough. China decided otherwise. In 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, worth $400 billion. When the deal was announced, many Western analysts dismissed it as diplomatic theater. 4 years later, the numbers make clear it was anything but. In 2024, China purchased 77% of all of Iran's crude oil exports, worth roughly $29 billion in a single year. Iran's total oil revenues that year reached $67 billion, a level the country had not seen in over a decade. The sanctions remained officially in place. Their real-world impact had quietly collapsed. With the railway running, those oil flows no longer pass through any route the West can monitor or interrupt. Trains loaded in Iran roll east through Central Asian countryside and arrive in China without a single Western bank or financial institution touching the transaction. That is not trade operating at the margins of the rules. That is a completely parallel economic system built deliberately outside the architecture Washington constructed over generations. A central mechanism of that parallel system is currency. China has been settling oil purchases from Iran in yuan since 2012, bypassing the US dollar entirely. That detail sounds technical, but its implications are profound. The dollar's dominance in global energy markets is one of the foundational pillars of American financial power. When oil is priced in dollars, every country that needs energy must hold dollars to buy it. That persistent global demand for dollars is what allows the United States to borrow cheaply, sustain large deficits, and maintain financial leverage over the entire international system. Every major energy deal settled in yuan instead of dollars is a quiet but real erosion of that foundation. Russia has pursued exactly the same approach, settling growing volumes of its energy exports in yuan and rubles. The combined weight of trade flowing outside dollar systems has grown sharply since 2022. This railway accelerates that trend. Iran's strategic value in this picture extends well beyond its oil reserves. The country sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which roughly 20% of all the world's oil flows every single day. That geography makes Iran a natural gateway for the entire surrounding region. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Afghanistan are completely landlocked, with no coastline and no direct access to global shipping. Through Iran's ports and China's expanding rail network, those countries gain meaningful economic connections for the first time. China simultaneously deepens its political and economic influence across a region that has historically sat within Western spheres of power. The railway is not simply a trade route. It is a structural realignment of relationships across an entire part of the world. That realignment has a defined next phase. The five-nation railway corridor will connect China, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Iran in one continuous network, adding roughly 1,300 kilometers of new track. A preliminary agreement was signed in December 2014, and progress, while measured, has never stopped. In May 2023, a test shipment ran from Iran into Afghanistan, carrying 655 tons of railway equipment. The tools literally needed to build more of the corridor. The railway was constructing itself one delivery at a time. Senior officials from Iran, China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Turkey met in Tehran in May 2025 to accelerate the expansion. The momentum is real. Behind all of it sits the financial architecture of the Belt and Road Initiative, which has committed over $1 trillion to infrastructure projects globally since 2013. Central Asia is one of its most strategically concentrated investment zones. The loan terms tied to these projects give China a durable economic and political presence in countries that previously had few alternatives for large-scale infrastructure investment. The influence accumulated through these arrangements is precisely the kind of influence the United States has been steadily ceding across the region. At the same time, China has been developing a second corridor running in the opposite direction entirely. The Northern Sea Route traces the northern coastline of Russia through the Arctic Ocean and represents the most direct shipping path between Asia and Europe. It cuts the journey from roughly 45 days via the Suez Canal down to around 30. The obstacle has always been the ice. Until recently, the route was only navigable for around 88 days per year. That window is expanding as Arctic temperatures rise. Russia and China signed a formal agreement in June 2024 to develop a year-round Arctic shipping line. Russia has already commissioned the most powerful icebreakers ever built to support it. The Arctica weighs 33,000 tons, runs on 2 nuclear reactors, and can crush through ice up to 3 meters thick continuously for 7 years without refueling. The strategic significance of the Arctic route is not just speed, it is elimination. The Suez Canal sits within a zone of deep Western diplomatic and financial influence. Insurance, financing, and logistics for Suez-routed shipping run overwhelmingly through European and American institutions. A viable Arctic corridor cuts every one of those dependencies out of the chain entirely. 2 routes are now being built simultaneously, one across Central Asia on steel rails, one through the frozen north on nuclear-powered hulls, both designed to operate entirely outside the systems the West controls. Honesty requires acknowledging the real limits of what this railway can currently do. A single supertanker carries 2 million barrels of oil per voyage. Matching that by rail requires hundreds of trains. The volume gap between maritime and rail freight is enormous and will not close in any near-term timeframe. Multiple border crossings introduce delays and political dependencies that can shift without warning. Fixed rail infrastructure is far easier to target than ships moving freely at sea. Those vulnerabilities proved real. 19 days after the first freight service launched, large-scale strikes hit Iranian oil and gas infrastructure. No further public freight services were reported on the corridor after those strikes. The railway stalled almost as fast as it started. But the deeper point survives all of that. This railway does not need to replace ocean shipping to matter. It needs only to exist as a credible alternative. When China has a functioning land route for energy, the threat of a naval blockade at Malacca loses its absolute character. When Iran has a committed buyer operating outside Western financial systems, sanctions lose their stranglehold. When landlocked Central Asian nations gain rail access to global markets, they gain the ability to choose their partners on their own terms. None of these shifts announce themselves dramatically. They accumulate quietly, one train at a time. Every kilometer of track China lays across Central Asia carries a message to every smaller country watching from the sidelines. The message is never stated directly. It communicates through the physical reality of functioning infrastructure. It says, there is another option.
You do not have to build your trade, your debt, or your foreign policy around the preferences of Washington or Brussels. That message, aimed at an audience far larger than Iran, may be the most consequential thing this railway delivers. What America is watching is not a railway. It is the deliberate construction of an alternative to a system the West built and defended across generations.
a system resting on naval dominance, dollar dependency, and control of the choke points that global trade cannot avoid. The alternative taking shape is incomplete, fragile in places, and facing obstacles that are real. But it is operating in places where the old rules no longer reach, and the track laid through those deserts is still there. Infrastructure is never just infrastructure. Every tunnel drilled, every kilometer of rail laid, every nuclear-powered icebreaker launched carries a single message. The world does not have to work the way it always has. The countries building understand that. So do the countries watching. The railway is the opening move. What follows will arrive the same way this did, quietly, steadily, one freight train at a time. If this changed how you think about global power, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what we cover next. And drop a comment below with your answer to this question. Can a land corridor across Central Asia and a frozen Arctic sea route ever seriously challenge the dominance of the world's oceans? Or is the sea still the undisputed king of global trade?